The desert had not seen rain in 11 months, so when the sky lit up orange at 3 in the morning, the local farmers thought it was a meteor. It was not a meteor. It was a ship, tumbling end over end, trailing smoke that smelled like burnt metal and something sour no one could name. It hit the sand hard enough to shake windows 40 miles away. Far above the planet, a Consortium disposal officer named Torv logged the drop into his console without much thought. His job was simple: find dead systems with low-value worlds, dump the scrap there, and move on before anyone asked questions. Earth had been on the disposal list for 6 years. Nobody in the Consortium bothered to check what happened to the junk after it landed. Why would they? The species down there had barely reached orbit with their own machines. The ship, an old war cruiser called the Rustwake, was stripped of weapons, stripped of navigation charts, and left to rust. Torv marked the file closed and forgot about it before his shift ended. He should not have forgotten so easily. By sunrise, 3 unmarked trucks were already crossing the dunes toward the crash site. They belonged to no single country. They belonged to a quiet group of governments that had agreed, years earlier, to share anything unusual that fell from the sky before the public ever heard about it. Leading the convoy was a woman named Grace Holloway, a field director who had spent the last decade studying debris that never made the news. She had seen wreckage before. She had never seen anything like this. The ship was longer than 3 football fields, half buried in sand, its hull cracked open like an egg. Where metal should have been dull and lifeless, it pulsed faintly with a soft blue light, as if some part of it were still breathing. Grace climbed out of her truck and stood at the edge of the crater, staring up at the broken hull towering over her. "It's not debris," she said quietly. "It's a whole ship." Her team moved fast. Within hours, engineers, physicists, and soldiers had sealed off a 50-mile radius, feeding the press a story about a military exercise gone wrong. Nobody questioned it. Nobody ever did. Inside the wreck, the air was thick with dust and the strange metallic smell from the crash. Portable lights swept across corridors built for bodies taller and thinner than human ones. Doors that should have been locked hung open, as if the ship had given up trying to protect itself. Grace walked through the wreckage slowly, running her hand along a wall covered in symbols no one on Earth could read. Then she found the core chamber. It was a room the size of a warehouse, filled with machinery that looked both ancient and impossibly advanced. Thick cables ran along the ceiling like veins. In the center sat a massive cylindrical reactor, cracked but intact, still humming faintly with leftover power. Grace had spent her whole career waiting for a moment like this, and now that it had arrived, she felt something closer to fear than excitement. "This wasn't just scrap to them," said a voice behind her. It belonged to Daniel Voss, a propulsion engineer who had been pulled from a university lab 2 hours earlier and given no explanation beyond "pack a bag." He stepped past her, eyes fixed on the reactor. "This is decades ahead of anything we've built, maybe centuries." "They didn't think we'd ever figure that out," Grace said. "Then they made a mistake." By the end of the first week, the truth was clear. The ship had not malfunctioned. It had been deliberately dumped, its weapons removed, its maps erased, treated the same way a person might throw out a broken chair. To the Consortium, Earth was nothing more than a convenient junkyard, a rock too primitive to matter and too far from anywhere important to worry about. Grace called an emergency meeting with the handful of officials who knew about the discovery. The room was tense, filled with people who understood that whatever decision they made next would shape the future of the entire planet. "We have 2 choices," she told them. "We report this to the world and hope someone else doesn't get here first, or we keep it quiet, learn everything we can, and make sure that when they realize what happened, they're not dealing with a species they can push around anymore." Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then a general at the end of the table nodded slowly. "Keep it quiet," he said. "Build something they'll regret leaving behind." That night, the first official order was signed, creating a project with no public name and only one internal one. Anvil. Nobody in that room could have guessed how far it would go, or how badly the Consortium had underestimated the people they had dumped their garbage on. Grace stood outside the wreck as the desert cooled under the stars, looking up at the same sky the ship had fallen from. Somewhere out there, an alien officer had already forgotten about a ship he assumed was worthless. He was about to be reminded. A cracked screen does not usually make a grown man laugh out loud, but that is exactly what happened when Daniel Voss finally got one of the ship's control panels to light up after 9 days of failure. The laugh was short and a little crazy, the kind that comes out of someone who has not slept properly in over a week. The panel did not show words. It showed shapes, pulsing in slow patterns that meant nothing to anyone in the room. Still, it was power. It was proof the ship could be woken up. Getting there had not been easy. The alien metal resisted human drills, dulling blades in seconds and cracking tools that had never failed before. The wiring inside the walls was not really wiring at all, but thin ropes of some flexible material that carried both power and data at once, something Earth's own scientists had only theorized about. Every attempt to connect a human device to the ship's systems ended in sparks, smoke, or silence. "We're trying to speak their language with our alphabet," Daniel said one night, staring at a burned-out circuit board. "It's not going to work like that." So the team stopped trying to translate the ship's technology and started forcing it to work with what humans already understood. If a socket did not fit, they built a new one. If a wire carried too much power for human equipment, they built converters, crude but effective, bolted directly onto alien housing. It was not elegant. It was not how the ship's original builders would have done it. But piece by piece, it worked. While the engineers fought with metal and wire, a linguist named Priya Anand fought with something harder to see. She had been given hundreds of hours of recovered data logs, most of them corrupted, all of them written in symbols with no dictionary. She built her own, one guess at a time, cross-referencing patterns that repeated near warning lights, near maps, near numbers that looked like measurements. 3 weeks in, she found a phrase that repeated often enough to translate with confidence. It appeared next to old maintenance records for the ship. Class expendable, combat value none, disposal authorized. She sat with that sentence for a long time before showing it to Grace. "They didn't just throw this away," Priya said. "They wrote it off completely. This ship fought in something, survived it, and then got treated like garbage because it wasn't good enough to keep." Grace looked at the translation, then out the window toward the hangar where the ship sat under tarps and scaffolding. "Good," she said. "Let them keep thinking that." The reactor became Daniel's obsession. Alien engineering had built it to run at a steady, careful output, protected by layers of safety systems designed to prevent exactly the kind of stress humans now wanted to put it under. Every attempt to push past those limits triggered automatic shutdowns. Instead of accepting the limits, Daniel's team rewired the safety systems entirely, replacing cautious alien logic with human override switches bolted directly into the core housing. It was reckless by any standard the ship's original engineers would have approved of. It was also exactly the kind of shortcut humans had used for over a century to get machines to do things they were never designed to do. The first real test happened at midnight, with most of the base evacuated except for a skeleton crew and Daniel refusing to leave the control room, no matter how many times Grace told him to. The reactor ignited. For half a second the room went completely white, and every gauge in the control room spiked past anything the alien systems were built to measure. Then, impossibly, it stabilized, humming at a pitch far higher and rougher than anything the ship's original design intended. The lights across the hangar flickered on one by one, section by section, as power finally reached parts of the ship that had been dead since the crash. Daniel stood frozen. Watching numbers climb on a screen he barely understood, sweat running down his back despite the cold night air. "It's not supposed to run this hot," he whispered. "Does it matter?" Grace asked from the doorway, arms crossed, watching the ship breathe for the first time in years. Daniel looked at the reactor core glowing behind reinforced glass, then back at her. "No," he admitted, "I guess it doesn't." Outside, for the first time since the crash, the ship's hull lit up along its full length, casting long shadows across the desert sand. Somewhere far above, in the cold quiet of space, nobody noticed yet. But on the ground, in a hangar nobody official would admit existed, something the Consortium had called worthless had just taken its first breath. It would not be the last surprise they got wrong about this planet. 6 months after the reactor first ignited, the hangar no longer looked like a crash site. It looked like a shipyard, though nobody outside a small circle of people knew it existed. Cranes moved along the hull day and night. Sparks rained down from welding rigs bolted directly onto alien plating. The ship that had once been dead metal in the sand now had a name, though it was never written down anywhere official. The crew simply called her the Anvil, because that was what she had become, something built to take a beating and hit back harder. The original alien design had almost no weapons left, stripped clean before disposal. What remained were empty mounting points, hollow sockets where cannons or shield generators once sat. To the engineers, empty sockets were not a problem. They were an invitation. Human weapons theory had spent over a century solving problems the Consortium had apparently stopped worrying about long ago, back when their ships were considered too advanced to need improvement. Railguns, originally designed for Earth's own experimental Navy programs, were reshaped and forced into the old mounting points. Missile arrays, never meant to survive extreme heat, were rebuilt using alloy scavenged from parts of the ship too damaged to save otherwise. Nothing fit perfectly. Everything worked anyway. A new face joined the project during this stretch, a woman named Captain Ray Dalton, though everyone quickly learned that Ray suited her better than any title. She had spent 15 years flying aircraft that pushed past their design limits on purpose, the kind of pilot who read a warning label as a suggestion rather than a rule. When she first stepped inside the Anvil's cockpit, built for hands and bodies shaped nothing like hers, she spent 3 days simply sitting in the chair, learning where her fingers needed to go instead of where the original design expected them. "This wasn't built for us," she said to Daniel one afternoon, adjusting a control stick that had been welded on sideways to fit human wrists. "Nothing here was," Daniel replied. "We're just better at making do." Word of unusual activity in the desert eventually reached outside ears. A foreign intelligence unit picked up strange energy readings from satellite data nobody official could explain, readings that spiked at odd hours and vanished just as fast. Within weeks, 2 operatives posing as environmental researchers arrived near the restricted zone, cameras hidden in ordinary equipment. Grace found out about them within a day. Project Anvil's security had grown far beyond simple guards and fences by then. She made the call herself, quiet and calm, ordering the 2 agents intercepted before they got close enough to see anything useful. No violence, no confrontation, just a firm redirection and a very convincing cover story about hazardous chemical testing in the area. "They'll be back," Grace told the team afterward, "or someone else will." That warning sped everything up. Testing schedules that once stretched over weeks were compressed into days. Sleep became optional for most of the senior engineers. The ship's outer hull, still scarred from the crash, was reinforced further with layered human-designed armor plating, welded directly over sections too damaged to trust on their own. It was not beautiful. Grace once joked that the ship looked like it had been stitched together by someone who hated symmetry. Nobody argued with her, because nobody could deny it worked. The night of the first flight test arrived without warning to most of the base. Only a small group knew it was happening. Ray sat in the cockpit, hands resting on controls that still felt slightly wrong under her fingers, listening to Daniel's voice crackle through a radio patched together from 3 different systems that were never meant to talk to each other. "Reactor's stable," Daniel said, "whenever you're ready." Ray exhaled once, slow and steady, the way she always did before doing something dangerous. Let's see what garbage can do. The engines roared to life with a sound unlike anything the desert had ever heard, deep and rough, nothing like the smooth hum the ship's original engineers had designed it to produce. The Anvil lifted off the ground slower than expected, then faster, climbing hard enough to rattle windows across the hangar. Ray pushed the throttle further than any test plan recommended, feeling the ship shudder, adjust, and hold. From the ground, Grace watched the massive shape cut through the night sky, trailing fire and light where alien engineering met human stubbornness. It was loud. It was rough. It was, by any Consortium standard, an embarrassment of poor design choices layered on top of each other. It was also flying faster than anything the Consortium had ever built for a ship its size. Grace allowed herself a small, tired smile as the Anvil banked hard against the stars, engines screaming in a way that felt less like malfunction and more like a warning. Somewhere far above the planet, sensors that had not been checked in years quietly began recording activity no one had authorized. The scrap heap was no longer sitting quietly where it had been left. Routine checks were supposed to be boring. That was the whole point of them. A Consortium patrol officer named Sella had flown the same verification route for 11 years, cruising past old disposal sites just long enough to confirm nothing important had happened. Dead systems stayed dead. That was the rule. So when her scanner picked up an active power signature coming from a supposedly scrapped vessel near a low-value planet on the edge of a quiet system, she assumed it was equipment failure. She ran the scan twice. Both times it came back the same. Something aboard the discarded cruiser, known as the Rustwake, was very much alive. She reported it up the chain, expecting to be told it was sensor drift. Instead, she was ordered to send a small recon team down to confirm the reading and shut down whatever malfunction was causing it. Nobody on that recon crew expected trouble. Disposal sites did not fight back. The recon shuttle entered Earth's orbit quietly, running dark to avoid drawing attention from a species not expected to notice anyway. What it found instead was a fully powered warship holding position exactly where the wreck should have been. Hull patched, weapons active, engines glowing with a heat signature that did not match any known Consortium design. Inside the Anvil's cockpit, Ray Dalton watched the unknown shuttle appear on her display and felt her pulse pick up for the first time in weeks. "We've got company," she said into the comm. "Small craft, no weapons signature that I can see. Could be scouts." Grace's voice came back steady from mission control on the ground. "Do not fire first. Let them make the mistake." Ray eased the Anvil forward, closing the distance just enough to make her presence impossible to ignore. The alien shuttle slowed, clearly caught off guard, drifting for several long seconds before finally opening a channel. The voice that came through was translated a moment later by software built from months of Priya's painstaking work. "Unidentified vessel. This unit is registered as decommissioned. State your authorization for activation." Ray glanced at the readout, then keyed her mic, letting a small smile creep into her voice. "Authorization. We found it in a dumpster. Figured we'd keep it." There was a pause on the other end, long enough that Ray wondered if the translation software had failed. Then the voice returned, sharper this time. "This technology exceeds your species' development level. Return control of the vessel immediately, or it will be reclaimed by force." "You're welcome to try," Ray said. What happened next was not planned by either side. The Consortium shuttle, likely under pressure to prove the situation was under control, powered up a weak defensive field and attempted to lock a tractor beam onto the Anvil's hull, treating the confrontation as routine equipment recovery rather than an actual fight. It was a mistake born from confidence that had never been tested. The Anvil systems, rebuilt with human logic layered over alien architecture, reacted in a way the shuttle's sensors did not expect. Instead of a measured, cautious response, the ship's weapons array powered up far past the safe limits the original Consortium engineers would have allowed, discharging a short burst calibrated by Daniel's team to disable rather than destroy. The tractor beam sparked and died. The shuttle's shields buckled under a hit stronger than anything its design specifications accounted for, sending the smaller craft spinning before its pilot regained control. Silence followed, heavy and stunned on both sides of the exchange. "Status," Grace said quickly over the comm, watching data scroll across her screen in the control room below. "They're disabled, not destroyed," Ray reported, voice tight with adrenaline. "Engines look intact. They can limp home." On the Consortium shuttle, Sella stared at her damaged console, ears ringing faintly from the impact, trying to understand what had just happened. The species below, the one her people had barely bothered to classify, had just outmatched a Consortium recon craft using technology assembled from parts they had personally thrown away. "Return to base," she ordered her crew, voice shaking slightly despite her effort to sound calm. "Now." The shuttle limped away from Earth's orbit, trailing sparks, leaving behind a warship that should not have existed, and a species that had just proven it was done being ignored. Back on the Anvil, Ray exhaled slowly, hands still gripping the controls a little too tightly. "Well," she said into the comm, half laughing despite herself, "that's one way to introduce ourselves." Below her, on a planet the Consortium had once considered nothing more than convenient disposal space, engineers and scientists who had spent over a year turning garbage into a weapon finally allowed themselves a single moment to celebrate. It would not last long. Word was already traveling back through Consortium channels, and it would not be received quietly. News travels strangely across the stars. It does not move at the speed of light. It moves at the speed of embarrassment, and embarrassment moves very fast when a Consortium recon shuttle limps home with its shields blown out by a ship that was supposed to be dead metal in a desert. The report reached the Consortium Council within 2 days. By the third day, it had already been argued about in 5 separate meetings, none of which reached the same conclusion. Some officials insisted it was a fluke, a rare malfunction in an outdated system that had somehow retained partial power. Others, quieter and more nervous, pointed out that a fluke did not explain weapons fire calibrated precisely enough to disable a shuttle without destroying it. That kind of precision took intention. Intention took understanding. A council member named Oren, known mostly for his caution rather than his courage, raised the question nobody wanted to answer directly. If a species we classified as primitive activated a decommissioned warship and modified its weapons systems within roughly one of their years, he said, what exactly does that tell us about how we classified them? The room went quiet, the kind of quiet that meant everyone agreed but nobody wanted to say it out loud. Down on Earth, the atmosphere was very different. Project Anvil could no longer stay hidden, not after satellite anomalies and unexplained flashes of light had drawn attention from too many governments to control quietly. Rather than risk a leak turning into panic, Grace and her team made the call to go public in a careful, controlled way. The announcement did not include everything. It did not mention the Consortium by name, or the full scope of what had been built in the desert. It simply confirmed that an object of unknown origin had crashed months earlier, that it had been recovered and studied, and that humanity now possessed technology far beyond anything publicly known before. The reaction was chaos, disbelief, excitement, and fear all tangled together. But it was controlled chaos, guided carefully by a team that had spent over a year preparing for exactly this moment. With the truth partially out, resources poured into the project almost overnight. What had once been a secret operation running on borrowed equipment and stretched budgets suddenly had the backing of multiple governments working together for the first time in living memory. New ships began construction, smaller than the Anvil, but built using knowledge pulled directly from her systems. Engineers who once worked in isolation now had entire factories at their disposal. Priya Anand, promoted from lone linguist to head of what was now called contact preparations, worked with grace to build something the Consortium clearly had not expected. An organized, confident response instead of a frightened one. "They're going to send someone," Priya said one evening, reviewing translated fragments pulled from years of the Rustwake's old logs. "Not soldiers, diplomats. They'll want to smooth this over quietly before it becomes a bigger problem for them." "Let them try," Grace said. "We're not hiding anymore." She was right. Within weeks, Consortium sensors detected a growing pattern of activity around Earth that could no longer be dismissed as isolated incidents. Reluctantly, the Council authorized an official delegation, framed publicly within their own ranks as a routine diplomatic visit meant to resolve a technology dispute. Privately, everyone involved understood it as something closer to damage control. Oren, despite his earlier caution, was chosen to lead the delegation, partly because he was one of the few voices who had argued for taking the situation seriously from the start. He reviewed reports on the newly built human fleet with a mixture of professional concern and quiet disbelief. Ships assembled in under a year, using salvaged and reverse-engineered technology, already numbered in the dozens, arranged not in scattered defense but in coordinated formation. "They've had this technology for barely any time at all," he muttered to an aide as their ship prepared for departure. "And they've already organized it better than some of our own outposts." The journey to Earth was short by Consortium standards, though it felt long to a species used to underestimating everyone they encountered. As their ship crossed into Earth's system, sensors picked up the Anvil first, holding position at the edge of a growing formation of smaller escort vessels, engines glowing steady and strong against the black of space. Oren stared at the display for a long moment, absorbing the sight of a fleet that should not have existed, built entirely from what his own people had once thrown away. "Open a channel," he said quietly. "Let's see exactly what we're dealing with." Below, on the planet they had once considered nothing more than a convenient dumping ground, Grace watched the delegation's arrival on her own screen, steady and unshaken. "They're here," she said to the room around her. Nobody in that room felt fear. For the first time since the ship had crashed into the desert, they felt something closer to readiness. The meeting room aboard the Anvil had not existed a year earlier. It had been built specifically for this moment, carved out of a section of the ship once used for storage, now fitted with a long table, careful lighting, and enough reinforced glass to make everyone in the room feel just a little safer without saying why. Grace Holloway sat near the head of the table, flanked by Ray Dalton in dress uniform and Priya Anand, whose translation work would carry the weight of everything said in the next hour. Oren entered with two aides, moving slowly, studying the room the way someone studies a puzzle they do not fully trust. He had expected fear from this species, or at the very least deference. What he found instead was calm, practiced patience, the kind that came from people who had already decided how this conversation would go. "We are here," Oren began, his translated voice carrying a careful, formal tone, "to resolve a misunderstanding regarding decommissioned Consortium property." "There's no misunderstanding," Grace said evenly. "You dumped a ship on our planet, we found it, we fixed it. It's ours now." Oren's expression, unreadable to human eyes but clearly tense to his own aides, tightened slightly. "That vessel represents technology beyond your species' development level. Its continued use by an unregistered civilization creates instability across multiple systems." "Funny," Ray said from her seat, arms crossed. "It seemed pretty stable when it disabled your recon shuttle without breaking a sweat." The comment landed harder than Ray intended, and for a moment the room sat in tense silence. Priya translated it carefully, softening nothing, letting the words carry their full weight. Oren's aide, a sharper and more hostile officer than Oren himself, leaned forward. A single successful engagement does not prove competence, it proves luck. Then test it, Grace said simply. We're not asking for luck, we're asking for recognition, sovereign status, trade rights, and an end to this system being used as your trash can. The demand hung in the air, blunt and unapologetic. Oren studied Grace for a long moment, clearly recalculating whatever plan he had walked in with. You understand, he said slowly, that granting such status is not a small matter. It has never been offered to a species so newly discovered. You didn't discover us, Priya said, speaking for herself this time rather than translating. You threw garbage at us and hoped we wouldn't notice. We noticed. The hostile aide, unwilling to let the meeting end without some show of strength, rose from his seat. If words are not enough, perhaps a demonstration is required. Prove this vessel's capability is more than a fortunate accident. Grace glanced at Ray, who gave the smallest nod. This had been planned for, discussed for weeks, agreed upon carefully to avoid crossing into actual conflict while still making the point unmistakably clear. Fine, Grace said. Follow us to the observation deck. Minutes later, the delegation watched through reinforced glass as the Anvil's weapon systems powered up in full view, not aimed at the Consortium shuttle waiting cautiously nearby, but at a decommissioned satellite drifting harmlessly at a safe distance, one the Consortium themselves had left behind decades earlier during an old survey mission. The shot that followed was precise, contained, and utterly unnecessary in its raw power, vaporizing the old satellite in a flash bright enough to be seen from the ground below. No message was needed beyond the display itself. Oren watched in silence, his aide considerably paler than before. As you can see, Grace said calmly, luck doesn't usually come with that kind of accuracy. The negotiations that followed moved faster than anyone expected. Within days, terms were drafted, revised, and finally agreed upon. Recognition of Earth as a sovereign, independent species, formal trade rights, and a binding agreement ending the use of Earth's system as a disposal site for Consortium waste. Oren signed on behalf of the Council, aware that resisting further would only risk deeper embarrassment for a Consortium, already struggling to explain how badly they had misjudged a single dismissed planet. As the delegation's ship departed Earth's orbit, Grace stood on the Anvil's observation deck, watching it shrink into the distance alongside Daniel and Ray. They'll spin this back home, Daniel said. Make it sound like their idea. Let them, Grace replied. We got what we wanted. Back in the hangar below, new blueprints were already spread across tables, no longer limited to salvaged alien parts and improvised human fixes. For the first time, engineers sketched a warship built entirely from scratch, combining everything learned from a year of forced innovation with knowledge no longer bound by scrap metal and desperation. Daniel ran a hand along the edge of the newest design, smiling faintly at how far things had come from a cracked control panel in a half-buried wreck. This is just the beginning, he said quietly. Above him, through the hangar's open doors, the Anvil sat gleaming under the desert sky, no longer a piece of garbage someone else had thrown away, but the first proof of exactly what humanity could build when given the smallest opportunity to prove itself.